We've been hearing it for over a year now. Democracy is in danger. Republicans are trying to suppress minority votes. Yeah, in order to ram through new legislation, Democrats are even considering nuking the filibuster, something most of them have vocally opposed for years, in some cases decades. So what's behind the hysteria? Well, in this special edition of Hold the Line, we'll take a look at Democrats' calls for voting rights legislation and separate fact from fiction. Welcome to this special edition of Hold the Line. I'm Buck Sexton. They don't go with the facts, do they? They don't keep it straightforward about voter suppression. Like, for example, who's being suppressed? Well, what's happening? Where is this occurring? They're very upset about it. We know that. In fact, they often claim the Democrats will tell you, if you don't change at the federal level, voting across the country in every single state to their liking, not only are you suppressing minority votes and therefore you're a racist, and as Joe Biden says, you're on the side of Bull Connor and Jefferson Davis. I mean, terrible things that he said. He actually said that, by the way. Not only that, the end of our democracy will occur unless you give Democrats their way as they cry and throw tantrums about voting rights. Watch.
If the Democrats fail, it might be the end of American democracy.
I think we're one election away from the end of American democracy.
If they take over in 2022, that is the end of democracy, and we're going to have authoritarianism.
I hope that we can flip this and save democracy. If we can't, I gotta believe that fascism will take over in America, and that will be the death of democracy.
The potential death of democracy.
The death of democracy.
The death of democracy.
The death of democracy as we know it.
This protest now is not simply about the death of George Floyd. It's about the death of American democracy, decency, and humanity.
I'm sad to say that it also can lead to the diminishment of democracy, if not its death.
It almost feels like we are witnessing the death of democracy here.
The death of democracy line stood out to me, Jonathan, because I think that's just factually correct.
Kind of the end of democracy, at least the end of our democracy.
The end of democracy. I mean, these people are a joke. I mean, I would laugh, except it's after a while it becomes more annoying than funny. Like, what are they even talking about? Who exactly is doing this killing of democracy that they're talking about? The ending of democracy. I'm just wondering. Can they give us a little more in the way of specifics on this one? Can they just give us some sense of what's going on here? Well, as you know, this is really just about calling Republicans racist without any actual evidence or justification. Just they want to call Republicans racist. Do what we want. Make it so that cheating is really easy in elections. Get rid of voter ID. Doesn't matter, the Supreme Court's already looked at the voter ID issue and said that it is fine, it is constitutional. Doesn't matter. It's racist. That's what they want to say. In fact, here's Joe Biden saying this is all about Republicans stopping minorities from voting. Watch.
Maybe I'm just being too much of an optimist. But remember how we thought not that many people were going to show up to vote in the middle of a pandemic? We had the highest voter turnout in the history of the United States of America. Well, I think if, in fact, no matter how hard they make it for minorities to vote, I think you're going to see them willing to stand in line and defy the attempt to keep them from being able to vote. I think you're going to see the people we're trying to keep from being able to show up, showing up and making the sacrifice that needs to be made in order to change the law back to what it should be.
Change the law back to what it should be. Meaning the laws that they changed in an election year based upon the pandemic, which is a once-in-a-century pandemic. They said it was an emergency. Now what they said was for emergency only has to be forever or else racism. These people are gross. They really are. And they misrepresent all of this all the time. This is why separating fact from fiction about voting rights is so critically important. For example, the Senate Majority Leader for now, hopefully not by the end of this year, but Chuck Schumer, who is just rapaciously dishonest, says that in Georgia they make it a crime to serve water in a sandwich and how that's greatly restricting early voting. Watch.
They're telling people that in Georgia, where there are much longer lines in African-American precincts than in white precincts, that it's a crime to serve water or a sandwich, greatly restricting or eliminating early voting.
It's not a crime to serve water, but that's a lie. To start with that. And this all goes to whether they want people giving out food and possibly electioneering, because who's really going to know, hey, here's a sandwich, you know, Joe Biden sent it. You know what I mean? They don't want that happening. What? How many people are starving to death because they don't get food the one time every 4 years they maybe vote? I'm just wondering, are we really going to make this a big thing? They're trying to put some laws in place so that they don't have people, Democrats, by the way, because they're the ones who cheat, as we know, pulling all kinds of shenanigans. But they go all in on this stuff. They like to create this narrative of themselves as the great heroes of a new civil rights movement, as if we didn't have the old civil rights movement, which got the vote for everybody who's an American citizen, man, woman, regardless of race, right? So we had this huge victory, and yet what are we actually dealing with now? Well, they're saying that if you oppose their new voting rights legislation, voting rights, you're a domestic enemy. Here's Biden.
I will not yield. I will not flinch. I will defend the right to vote, our democracy against all enemies, foreign and, yes, domestic.
Foreign and domestic. Enemies, foreign and domestic. Using that language is not an accident, folks. Not an accident. And they will do whatever. They'll just lie to your face. I mean, Biden's saying, let's get rid of the filibuster, you know, for voting rights, just this one time. Watch this one.
State legislators can pass anti-voting laws with simple majorities. If they can do that, then the United States Senate should be able to protect voting rights by a simple majority. Today, I'm making it clear, to protect our democracy, I support changing the Senate rules, whichever way they need to be changed to prevent a minority of senators from blocking action on voting rights.
It's amazing. You know, in 2005, Joe Biden, just to give you a sense of this, opposed the filibuster. Watch this.
The nuclear option abandons America's sense of fair play. It's the one thing this country stands for, not tilting the playing field on the side of those who control and own the field. I say to my friends on the Republican side, you may own the field right now, but you won't own it forever. And I pray God when the Democrats take back control, we don't make the kind of naked power grab you are doing, but I'm afraid you will teach my new colleagues the wrong lesson.
All right, we've got a great lineup of guests for you on this special edition of Hold the Line. Up next, we'll talk to the Heritage Foundation's senior legal fellow Hans von Spakovsky about the truth behind the John Lewis Voting Rights Act the Democrats are so desperate to pass. Stay there. After failing twice to pass a federal elections takeover, liberals in Washington, D.C. have launched their most recent effort with a revamp of H.R. 4, the so-called John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. The bill would essentially nationalize election laws and allow the federal government to undermine common sense rules like voter ID. Let's bring in senior legal fellow, Heritage Foundation, and author of Our Broken Elections, How the Left Changed the Way You Vote, Hans von Spakovsky, to break down the details of H.R. 4. Hans, thanks for being with us.
Sure, thanks for having me.
All right, so just tell us primary provisions, stuff we got to know. When it comes to H.R. 4, we know the left, the Democrat Party, is obsessed with this. Why do they care so much about it? What would it do?
Well, in essence, it would destroy all of the safety and security protocols that states have put in place. It would gut voter ID laws. It would prevent states from asking for an ID when people vote with an absentee ballot or any other kind of identifying information. It would ban witness signature requirements on absentee ballots. It would require states to put in same-day voter registration, which gives election officials no time to actually verify the information in a registration form. And it would have put severe restrictions on states when it comes to being able to actually maintain the accuracy of their voter rolls. It also had all kinds of odd things, Buck, like it established a public funding program for congressional candidates. Now, what does that have to do with voting rights? You know, absolutely nothing. And the average taxpayer looking at that is going to say, wait a minute, you mean my taxes are going to be used to fund the congressional campaigns of candidates that I don't like, I would never send money to, and I certainly wouldn't vote for. I mean, those are the kind of provisions that were in there.
So Democrats have had these hearings, right, to try to generate support for H.R. 4, but the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. They're not going to be able to get it through. So what was the point of all of it? I mean, is this just all essentially for the creation of a political narrative that Republicans are racist because they won't give us everything we want on voting?
Yes, all of the above. I mean, that was part of it, to create this false narrative that there's voter suppression going on across the country, intended to basically scare voters because they think it'll help them with turnout and they think it'll help them politically. But they also were hoping that if they made this constant cry of racism, they would scare Republicans, for example, into voting for this really noxious bill in the United States Senate. Fortunately, that didn't work. I mean, just look, another quick example. H.R. 4 would have given the U.S. Justice Department the ability to basically veto almost any election bill or election change passed by state legislatures or even by voters in a referendum. This is the same Justice Department whose head of the Civil Rights Division, who would be given this power, a woman named Kristen Clark, when she was a student at Harvard University, penned a letter in the Harvard Crimson saying that Black Americans are physically, mentally, and spiritually superior to all other races. Those are the kind of people that would have had control over elections in this country.
Here is Sheila Jackson Lee on her analysis of what's going on here with Republican opposition to H.R. 4. This is what a sitting member of Congress had to say about it.
Tragically, we have not had this historical opposition to our individual rights since before slavery. An entire party, the Republican Party now, is committed to voter suppression. This is a war on Black people as it relates to voting. And unfortunately, it seems that the Supreme Court is now going to participate with its seemingly intended decision to narrow the only remaining aspect of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, which we are trying to fix with the John Robert Lewis legislation in H.R. 4.
Okay, I mean, she says a war on Black people as it pertains to voting. Where is this? I feel like they talk about suppression a lot, and particularly racist voter suppression. Do they have? Right. I mean, and I ask you this honestly: do they actually have any evidence that this is occurring systematically, or really anywhere?
No, there's absolutely no evidence of that whatsoever. Keep in mind, Buck, that they've been making this claim actually for the past 10 years, although they made it even more in the past year, that there's voter suppression going on. Anybody who thinks there's any truth to that, all you have to do is look at the turnout in the last presidential election. The Census Bureau reported that we had the highest voter registration in a presidential election over the prior 5 presidential elections. Not only that, but we had the highest turnout in a presidential election since 1992. So that tells you that no one is having any problems registering or voting. By the way, Black turnout, for example, in the 2020 election was higher than turnout in the 2016 election during the 4 years of the Trump administration, after 4 years of the Trump administration. So this voter suppression, this is just a meme, a theme that the left created to try to push through the voting rules they want to be able to manipulate election results.
It feels like they're not going to drop this story anytime soon, or rather this push for what they call voting rights. Here is another member of Congress, I don't think an election expert by any stretch, but Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, talking about conservative Democrats who may be open to this, but also the difference between H.R. 1 and H.R. 4. I just wanted people to see this. I want you to break this down for us.
There are certain conservative Democrats like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema who do not support H.R. 1. I personally believe that a lot of this has to do with dark money and the checks on eliminating and really curtailing the power of lobbyists and dark money, but that's an aside. Nevertheless, there is resistance to passing H.R. 1 among Democrats in the Senate. What they have said is, we will not pass H.R. 1. I have resistance to H.R. 1, but we are open to H.R. 4.
Okay, H.R. 1 versus H.R. 4. What do folks need to know?
Well, the big difference between them is that H.R. 1 goes through and basically bans all these state practices I talked about, things like voter ID and witness signature requirements on absentee ballots, cleaning up voter rolls. What H.R. 4 does is give the Justice Department the power to veto any election law changes like that are passed by state legislatures. So the only real difference between the two is H.R. 1 just outright bans them. H.R. 4 will give the Justice Department the ability to veto any changes like that. And the Civil Rights Division, where this would happen, I used to work there. It is filled with some of the most left-wing partisan lawyers I've ever encountered. And if they weren't working for the Justice Department, they would be working for the DNC. So in essence, you're giving the DNC veto authority over what state legislatures want to do when it comes to election rules.
Hans, appreciate the expertise. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Democrats have spent more than a year attacking state election laws that they've dubbed Jim Crow 2.0. But is there any truth behind the hysteria? When we come back, senior contributor at The Federalist, Margot Cleveland, stops by to give her analysis of the state laws at the center of the national furor.
When we came out of Reconstruction in 1876, we started losing the right to vote. We started losing other freedoms, and we called it Jim Crow. We had a very successful election in 2020. People voted at higher levels than they ever had before. And in reaction to that, Georgia, Texas, and 17 other states started passing draconian voting rights laws. That, to me, is Jim Crow 2.0.
Jim Crow 2.0, the Democrats' efforts to pass its wide-ranging federal voting reform bill began early last year when they claimed that a number of states were adopting laws that were intended to suppress minority votes. So is there any truth behind the idea that these newly established state voter laws are indeed Jim Crow 2.0? Let me bring in senior contributor to The Federalist, Margot Cleveland. Margot, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So a lot has been made of these voting laws that have been passed in Texas, Georgia, and a number of other states. Let's start here. What were the actual intentions of these laws, and what do they actually do? I mean, tell us about this.
Sure. So most of the states saw the mess that we had in 2020 and was trying to address some of those problems, whether it was issues with drop boxes, voter IDs, just kind of a free-for-all for 2020. And the goal was to make sure that there was some integrity to the vote. And that's why what is coming out of Congress is just so crazy. We're not talking about preventing anyone from voting. In fact, a lot of these laws kept in place some of the absentee voting or early voting time periods, but they wanted to make sure that individuals who are voting are legally able to vote, that the person voting is voting in the right place, that it is actually that person voting. So these were not anything like Jim Crow, where those laws were specifically designed to prevent African Americans from voting, either based on a poll tax or based on where the individuals could vote. This has nothing to do with it.
So, Margaret, some of the measures that these states have instituted have a lot of support based on polling and what we know about preferences out there. A June 2021 Monmouth University poll shows Americans support voter ID by a wide majority, 80% supported. My understanding is that, by the way, this also extends to all racial groups have a majority, at least a majority, in some cases what you guys could call a supermajority of support for voter ID. Only 18%, though, across all categories oppose it. So what are we supposed to make of this? I mean, it just seems like we're not being told the truth by the Democrats who are claiming that voter ID is some racist scam.
Right. I actually think a helpful way of looking at this is not what did Georgia do, what did Texas do, because what Congress is trying to do, or I should say the Democrats are trying to do, is to gut all the state laws including voter ID, as you noted. But it's not just targeting the states that passed some laws in the last year or two. It is preventing every state from requiring photo IDs. As you said, a majority of people approve that. It's requiring states to do automatic registration. And this is not just of citizens, but the states basically roll over their driver's licenses automatically, and it floods the voter rolls with individuals who are not qualified to vote. So I actually think that the slide you just did is great. It shows this is what people support. But I also think we want to go a step further and say, what is this law doing beyond voter ID that is going to affect every single state in the country, not just Texas, not just Georgia? It is going to gut every state's voter law.
And because we often hear this, and we've heard really terrible stuff from the Biden administration in particular about how if you oppose any of this, their efforts to change voting laws at the federal level, you're a bad person, you're a racist, you're on the side of Bull Connor, George Wallace, and even Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy. That was a recent Joe Biden speech. What is the evidence of suppression? They keep talking about how there's suppression going on. Who is being told in this country, as a result of laws anywhere, that they can't vote, who is legally entitled to vote? Where is this suppression actually happening?
Right. There is no suppression. What there is are provisions that have long been on the books in all states that are designed to make sure that voting has integrity, that the person voting has the right to vote. No one is being suppressed. And actually, it is shocking to me that, well, I guess it's not shocking because this is what the press does, that Biden is doing such damage to the vote. Everything he said and everything Democrats are saying is 10 times worse than anything Trump said about the election in 2020. He's basically saying if you don't pass this, that blacks are not going to be allowed to vote and the results are not going to be valid. That is really horrible. And no one is being prevented from voting. And there really should be more outrage over that.
How are Republicans doing, by the way, Margot, when it comes to preparing for this midterm election and making sure that any legal challenges about practices that, let's say, were able to fly during the 2020 pandemic year election that really shouldn't have been? I mean, have Republicans gotten it together at the national levels? The RNC, are they mobilizing so that whatever needs to be done to make sure that voter fraud is discouraged and identified if it occurs, is that actually happening?
I'm not sure at the federal level, but we are seeing situations such as in Wisconsin where the court held that you couldn't have these drop boxes unless they were inside of the physical building, and things like that will help.
Sorry, I meant the national, I meant like nationally, like the national level GOP, not the federal government, right, which is in Biden hands, yeah.
Right. No, what I meant was that I'm not seeing it on the national level, but I'm sure that those state lawsuits are still being pushed by the local political parties. So on the federal level, I'm not sure if you have the RNC going in there, but in the individual states, you will see either Republicans or Republican groups going and pushing for those laws. So no, I haven't seen anything at the federal level yet. Frankly, I think that the Republicans that are more of the establishment ones are afraid. They think that they're going to be painted with the Kraken and the big lie if they say anything about the voting. They're afraid to talk about voting integrity, which is really unfortunate because it's a huge issue.
Just wondering, what do you think the Democrat plan is here, given what they were able to accomplish in 2020 with changing a whole lot of laws? Is it your expectation that they're going to say that either some of that state of emergency, shall we call it, approach will somehow be applicable in this election too?
I think that they are. I think that with COVID not being, stopped as Biden had promised us, that he's going to shut it down, that we still have enough of a emergency for that excuse to go. But I think we're going to see a two-pronged approach. I also think that when the voting rights law, as they call it in the federal one, fails, they're going to use that to kind of whip up the base and try to use that as an incentive to get people to go to the polls. And I think that at the same time, they are going to push to have some of these emergency provisions put back in place over time. The other part of it is our system is very screwed up. Even if they don't do that, what you saw out of Pennsylvania, and I've done several articles showing the videos there, our election system is a mess. They do not have the structure in, even without the kind of 2020 mess that we had. So there's still a lot of room for play out there.
Margot, thanks for bringing some expertise to this conversation. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Buck.
Thus far, Democrats' efforts to pass their sweeping election reform bill have been thwarted by one thing, the Senate filibuster rule. When we come back, I'll take a deep dive into the left's attacks on the filibuster in a special edition of The Buck Brief. Stay with us. For close to a year now, Democrats have been adamant about the need to pass their sweeping election reform bill. Fortunately for us, there's something that's been standing in their way, the Senate filibuster rule. The rule requires a vote of 60 senators to end debate on any piece of legislation and force a vote. So how have the Democrats reacted to this impediment to their absolutism? Well, they want to change the rules, of course. That's right. The party that promised to return to norms and our sacred democracy and all that stuff in the wake of Trump's presidency. They actually want to ignore those norms. In fact, break them. Go nuclear on them, even. We'll take a look at the left's efforts to dismantle the filibuster in tonight's special edition of the Buck Brief. So this is one of the areas where you can see Democrats are just enormous frauds, right? Because we have video of them. We could see right away that they used to say one thing, and now that the situation has changed, just with regard to power, just with regard to who's actually going to be calling the shots here if they get their way, now all of a sudden the principles that they were espousing before no longer apply because it wasn't about principles, right? We could see this. If you're wondering, I mean, we pulled together and I'm not talking about former Democrats versus the Democrats of today. You'll see a lot of these are Democrats who are still in the Senate, including Joe Biden himself, or still in the government, I should say. Joe Biden's obviously president, but he was a senator at the time. But you see this all across the board. You have all these Democrats who used to say, you know what, I support the filibuster, and then they changed their minds. This is from 2005 to 2018. Enjoy.
An example of the arrogance of power. It is a fundamental power grab by the majority party.
The bottom line is very simple. The ideologues in the Senate want to turn what the founding fathers called the cooling saucer of democracy into the rubber stamp of dictatorship.
What about that nuclear option, doing away with the filibuster?
Well, I can tell you that would be the end of the Senate as it was originally devised and created going back to our founding fathers.
My colleagues and I, everybody I've talked to believe that the legislative filibuster should stay there, and I will personally resist efforts to get rid of it.
There you had a bunch of Senate Democrats speaking vociferously in favor of the filibuster, and not just in rhetorical terms. They actually also took action based on their love of the filibuster as a sacred component of our democracy. Senate Democrat filibusters, just from 2019 to 2020, they used it 328 times. So they were all about the filibuster. Oh, they loved that filibuster when they were in the minority, of course. And if you're wondering, I mean, at what level of the Democrat establishment was their support for the filibuster in the past? None other than Barack Obama himself. Really the closest thing the Democrat Party has to a saint, I suppose. In 2005, he defended the filibuster. Gosh, look at this.
What they don't expect is for one party, be it Republican or Democrat, to change the rules in the middle of the game so that they can make all the decisions while the other party is told to sit down and keep quiet. The American people want less partisanship in this town, but everyone in this chamber knows that if the majority chooses to end the filibuster, if they choose to change the rules and put an end to democratic debate, then the fighting and the bitterness and the gridlock will only get worse.
Yeah, so you see that, you say, okay, well, Obama had a point back in 2005. I mean, he's making some sense about the filibuster for sure. There's a reason why it exists, and both parties have embraced it for many, many, many years, decades, in fact. And we see this and we say, okay, Barack Obama's. Oh, wait a second. In July of 2020, though, when Democrats are in the majority and all of a sudden they want what they want out of the Senate and they don't really care about anything else. Remember, that was Barack Obama 2005. This is Barack Obama when the Democrats have that 50 plus the tie break, of course, from Kamala, the vice president. Here's what he says about the filibuster. He said this, by the way, this is Obama giving a eulogy for John Lewis, and this is what he said at that eulogy about the filibuster. Yeah, watch.
By ending some of the partisan gerrymandering so that all voters have the power to choose their politicians, not the other way around. And if all this takes eliminating the filibuster, another Jim Crow relic, in order to secure the God-given rights of every American, then that's what we should do.
Relic of Jim Crow. It's so weird because Barack Obama, 2005, filibuster's great, sacred democracy, all that stuff. Democrats in the majority, oh, it's a relic of Jim Crow, racism. That's what they go with. And so we can see there's no principle involved here at all. They just want what they want. The Democrats want to wield power. They don't care about what they've said in the past. They don't care about what the rules are or have been, what they said before. What they're saying now is we want it our way. And that's it. And Joe Biden, from the very top on January 11th of this year, let everybody know he's the president. And yeah, he wants to get rid of the filibuster so that Democrats can get through a massive overhaul of voting laws in this country. Watch this one.
State legislators can pass anti-voting laws with simple majorities. If they can do that, then the United States Senate should be able to protect voting rights by a simple majority. Today, I'm making it clear, to protect our democracy, I support changing the Senate rules, whichever way they need to be changed to prevent a minority of senators from blocking action on voting rights.
He's so pathetic, isn't he? All right, as Democrats on Capitol Hill continue their attacks on state voting laws, Democrats in major cities around the country are passing legislation that would allow green card holders and other non-citizens to participate in local elections. Coming up, we'll talk to New York City Councilman Joe Borelli, a vocal opponent of the Big Apple's push for non-citizen voting. While Democrats in Washington are in hysterics about non-existent voter suppression across the nation, on the local level, leftists are passing legislation making it legal for non-citizens to vote in local elections. Cities in at least 4 states now allow non-citizen voting in some or all local elections. The latest is in New York City, where Mayor Eric Adams announced on January 9th he would sign legislation allowing non-citizen voting after initially expressing reservation about the bill. New York City Councilman Joe Borelli, who opposed the legislation, joins me now. Joe, my friend, always good to see you.
You too.
All right, you're a vocal opponent of this non-citizen voting in New York. Can you just tell us first and foremost, what does the legislation here actually do? Like, what was established with this non-citizen voting bill?
Right. So this law now allows folks who are here legally. It doesn't include people who are here illegally, but it includes anyone here legally on a work visa, on a green card, on any type of temporary permission to live in the United States. If they're here in New York City and can establish residency for 30 days, they are now eligible to vote in municipal elections, both for the mayor, the city comptroller, and the city council. Unfortunately, though, this is in direct violation of our state laws, which, of course, take precedent here. And that's why I'm one of the litigants and a plaintiff in a lawsuit to overturn this.
Oh, yeah. To tell us about the opposition. I mean, why, you just said the state law obviously conflicts with this, but beyond that, I mean, just in terms of the principles involved here, why do you oppose? Tell everyone at home why you think it is important to oppose people who are non-citizens voting in local elections.
Well, look, I mean, this essentially allows tourists. I mean, you could be here for 30 days and vote for mayor. As a matter of fact, if you were someone from the UK who lived in New York for over a month, you could have actually voted for London Mayor Sadiq Khan and for New York Mayor Eric Adams, all within about 45 days of each other. And to me, and to most people, that's actually somewhat ridiculous. Citizenship is a principle that almost every democracy treats in high regard. And citizenship often comes with it the power of suffrage, the power to vote in your elections. These aren't people who are non-citizens. Democrats are calling these people non-citizens. They are foreign citizens. Like I said, these are people here illegally. These are people here with a right to be. These are people here who actually hold foreign passports of other countries. They can vote in whatever jurisdiction they last had residency. And in fact, the irony of all this, Buck, is that there were as many no votes from Republican, Democratic city council members as there were Republicans, because this just cuts across sort of the ideological lines into almost the ridiculous. And then you have to bring in the component of this, which with respect to our state constitution. You have some states around the country going out of their way to pass citizenship requirements for voting, mostly as a result of cities like New York. New York not only has a constitutional amendment in the state constitution that outlines citizenship as a forebearer for the right to vote, but it also has a direct election law statute which explicitly says no one can vote in city, state, or county elections unless they're citizens of the United States. So it's scary. It's scary that any government, whether it's a city council or a state legislative body, would just end around existing law. They'll just completely disregard that it exists in an effort to bring sort of wacky progressive immigration values to all.
And here's Eric Adams back on January 1st of 2022 speaking about this 30 days to vote thing. Here's what the new mayor says.
We're going to look at the bill. I think it's the one part of the bill I'm concerned about, the 30-day part. If someone is in the city for 30 days, they have the right to vote. That's problematic for me. I understand the importance of local elections, but to give that power to someone that's here for 30 days, I think that's a problem. And I need to, in the next couple of days, make a determination what we're going to do.
So it looks like Eric Adams changed his mind about that voting situation. What happened?
Yeah, his initial gut was right. I mean, 30 days is ridiculous for a non-citizen. But here's the real irony. The actual sentence from which he's pulling this 30-day requirement from in existing state law, if you read the entire sentence, it says essentially that no one can vote in elections here unless they're a citizen and they lived here for 30 days. It's so ironic that he's changing his position on just 4 or 5 words of the very statute, which they're completely choosing to ignore when passing this bill. And by the way, Buck, as sure as I'm sitting here, and I'm sure as I've told you in the past, this is not going to be limited to New York City. New York State far-left Democrats have already introduced a bill in Albany to change non-citizen voting now for not just New York City municipal elections, but for all municipalities in the state and for statewide elections for governor, for a state comptroller, for state attorney general, for the state houses, state legislature. All of those elections now under this new bill would be eligible to be voted for by non-citizens. The only thing they can't actually change, thanks to the federal constitution, is voting for president.
The New York City Board of Elections requests that the state review non-citizen voting law. That was the New York Post. So we got a group of Republicans calling for the state to review that non-citizen voting legislation to see if it's even legal. You think this legislation is going to get overturned in the courts, Joe?
I actually think our Board of Elections is going to overturn this. I mean, I'm glad the Post covered this. It turns out that for all we may criticize our Board of Elections, they can read, and they can read the plain English statute of New York state law. So they asked their state counterparts to review the statute passed by the city council, and there's almost no scenario where a majority of these commissioners on both levels agree that this is in compliance with state law. Our Board of Elections in the city and our Board of Elections at the state is comprised of a board, and half of those boards are made up of Republicans. And I can say with certainty that none of the Republicans are going to comply with this law and say this actually meets the state standard. So there's going to be a stalemate, and I actually think we'll see more lawsuits in the form of the far left suing the Board of Elections to actually implement this than perhaps even the one that I'm a part of and I'm a plaintiff to try to stop it.
Joe, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Buck.
That's all the time we have for this special edition of Hold the Line. I'd like to thank my guests, Hans von Spakovsky, Margot Cleveland, and Councilman Joe Borelli. Have a great night and shields high.